When I was 12 years old, I was famous. I don't like to make a big deal of that. But you do have a child star up here. I had my picture on the front page of the Houston newspaper. I appeared on television. Everywhere I went in my small hometown, people said admiring things to me. My fame was the result of my winning against the odds a spelling competition. You may have seen the broadcasts of the finals of this competition. The Scripps Howard National Spelling Bee. Students can enter at the local school level and then advance through a series of widening competitions to the national finals held in Washington, D.C. As a 12-year-old with a well-developed competitive streak who entered any contest I could find, I took on the challenge of the spelling bee as the first student in my school ever to enter. The school agreed to sponsor me, but provided no additional help. My mother was my coach, drilling me on words each evening as we washed dishes alongside each other. I marched through the levels of competition between neighboring schools, between neighboring counties, and then outspelled students from across eastern and southern Texas to win a slot in the national competition. That was when I enjoyed the fame of a newspaper article in the Houston Chronicle, an appearance on a local PBS broadcast. It seemed so unlikely that a student, coached only by her mother, from a small town, should have outspelled students from larger schools with expert coaches. I was an interesting underdog story. So off to Washington, D.C. I went on my first trip outside the state, my first plane ride, only to be disqualified when I misspelled a word in the first day of competition. Thank you for your sympathy. Because I'd never expected to make it that far, my disappointment was short-lived, and I returned home to kind words about my doing a great job anyway. But I entered the competition the following year in a very different spirit, this time fiercely determined to win. Again, I marched through the first levels of competition to the state finals. A small group of us kept spelling correctly, round after round after round, till late in the afternoon when I faltered on the word kulak. Anybody want to spell that word? And was eliminated because what middle schooler would ever know such a word? This time I was crushed. My second year in the competition, and I did worse than my first year. I didn't even make it through state finals. How was I going to face classmates and townspeople, all of whom had assumed, or I assumed, that I was sure to succeed this time as an experienced competitor? Now, I'd be known as a failure. No matter that the competition was greater or that I was sick on the day of the contest, nothing mattered but the reality of losing, of being a failure. I wanted to hide for the rest of my life, since I figured for the rest of my life I would be marked as a failure. When I dragged myself to school the next week, people were kind, greeting me with "nice try" and "tough luck," though I was convinced luck had nothing to do with it. Near the end of that very long day, one of the teachers I disliked intensely, a humorless science teacher who ran his classroom as though he were a military sergeant, asked me to stay afterwards. I braced myself to hear some preaching about my having been unprepared. But instead, the teacher congratulated me. Not for my effort, certainly not for my accomplishment, since there had been nothing accomplished, but congratulated me for taking the risk of returning to competition a second time. He said, "You could have just let it go, feeling that your first year's effort was enough, kept enjoying the success you had in that, but you risked that success for the possibility of going farther. That took guts." This was a conversation I've never forgotten, and a conclusion that I still sometimes have trouble believing. With risk always comes the possibility of failure, yet to take a risk, to invite failure, can that be as important an act as an act of success? Is failure sometimes more than just an experience that feels shameful, something we want to forget as soon as possible? We're just beyond the midpoint of the month of January, and studies show that by now most New Year's resolutions have not only been broken, but abandoned. It seems that whether in sports or in spelling bees, whether we're competing for a job or a date with someone desirable or for a new settled minister, whether in keeping New Year's resolutions or staying on the latest diet, we are told by everyone, everywhere, throughout our lives, that success and winning is everything, that losers don't count, that failing at something is the worst thing you can do. Oh, there are plenty of good-hearted parents and teachers and coaches who try at times to tell us that there are more important values than winning, and failure is not the end of the world. But somehow those messages don't quite get very far. Instead, what we hear and absolutely know is that we must do all we can to be successful. We must take every precaution against making a mistake, against having things go wrong. Failure is not an option we give ourselves or one another. If a goal we set in congregational life, what a committee intends to accomplish, what the board intends to resolve, what amount of money we intend to raise in the annual pledge campaign, if those goals aren't met, do we pronounce those efforts failures? If your settled minister search committee completes its work and comes back empty-handed, either because no minister that was right for this congregation could be found, or because we didn't match with the minister the committee wanted, will you pronounce their work a failure? Humans are evaluating creatures. Our culture endlessly bombards us to make judgments. We get all those notes about wanting to take a 5-minute survey to tell us how we did. What do we do with those evaluations and judgments within the context of a spiritual community? In my experience with congregations, I see two equally unhelpful perspectives whenever some effort falls short. There is too quick a dismissal, a shrug, and a kind of, "Oh, well, that was a nice idea," so that the effort is rendered inconsequential and meaningless. Or there's a quick round of criticism, implying that success was possible if those making the effort had done things differently, so the effort is judged incompetent. And yet, was there ever a person who lived anywhere, anytime, who didn't fail? Has anyone among us here this morning actually achieved such a failure-proof state? And why do we so insist on perfection in ourselves, in one another, when it has yet to be attained? And why are we so merciless in blaming ourselves and one another for not being perfect, for failing? Novelist Ann Tyler, in her book Saint Maybe, presents the dilemma of a character who believes he one day made a terrible mistake that resulted in tragedy, and he spends the rest of his life trying to make things right again. One day after his mistake, he comes across a small congregation called the Church of the Second Chance, where he eventually gets involved and his healing begins. Most of my life, I've been looking for such a church. Though given my personal track record, I'm more likely to need a church of many chances, of infinite chances, rather than one offering a second chance. For I've accumulated a pretty impressive record of failure in my life, leaving in my wake broken relationships, lackluster ministries, incomplete work, unfinished degree programs, unrealized dreams. While I do believe I've been gifted with some talents, and while I believe I can summon up a good amount of willpower and self-discipline, I nonetheless seem to try many, many things, head off in multiple directions, and frequently fail. I like to tell myself that it's a case of being open to a host of possibilities. But I do wonder sometimes whether I'm missing something crucial that might enable me to see more of my efforts through to successful completion. That same pattern seems to be present throughout the natural world. Seeds are scattered widely, animals breed often, rivers and streams wind and double back, with most of these creative movements resulting in not a whole lot. Each successful effort has behind it a myriad of unproductive efforts, seeds that never grew, animals that met an early death, rivers that turn into stagnant backwaters. Nature casts a wide net and comes back with a small harvest. Yet spiritual traditions of many kinds seem to prefer a very different approach, holding before us the model of perfection and encouraging us to exercise care, to be deliberate, to choose our path with precision. This is a useful teaching, as we learned in the course of it, to make every effort count, to not be careless about most aspects of our lives. But this teaching too often gets corrupted into an overemphasis on perfection. Be perfect, as God in heaven is perfect, we hear. So to be imperfect becomes a turn away from what is sacred, even becomes a sin. And the only way to avoid the sin of imperfection seems to require that we be ever more careful, keep ever tighter control over all we say and do and think. And so the cycle continues. Failures are judged harshly. Maintaining control is a primary concern. You may recall the biblical story of the journey the Hebrew people made under the leadership of Moses as he first brought them out of enslavement in Egypt and then led them through a long wilderness trek to the Promised Land. At one point in that journey, Moses leaves the people on their own for a period of time while he's away on a mountaintop receiving the 10 Commandments directly from God. As days and weeks pass with no sign of Moses, as happens with a group when it's left without its leader for too long, the people grew restless. They felt their emotional and spiritual needs were not being met. There was a raucous congregational meeting. Ideas were tossed about, and the result was the Board of Trustees created a golden calf. A tangible idol for the people to take comfort in, rather than having to rely on the intangible, not quite so comforting notion of a God that was not available in the form of an idol. When Moses returned and found this state of affairs, he was livid. In fact, he had what is sometimes called a hissy fit. Shouting and stomping and culminating his fit by throwing the stone tablets that he had painstakingly chiseled under God's dictation, throwing them against the golden calf so that they broke into pieces. The people did penance. Moses eventually calmed down, and a new set of tablets were chiseled. And that's the conclusion of the story as it's given in the book of Exodus. But rabbinical commentary in time offered another element to the story, drawn from reflection on these events and on the possibility that some meaning other than a dispiriting story about people behaving badly might be drawn from it. This commentary claimed that those original tablets of the Ten Commandments, the ones broken by Moses in his anger, were not simply swept up and discarded. Rather, the pieces of the broken Ten Commandments tablet were carefully gathered up by some of Moses' helpers and stacked away in a safe place. Sometime afterwards, God told Moses it was time for the whole group to resume the journey to the Promised Land, but the new tablets of the Ten Commandments were to be transported in a special carrying case called an ark. The ark had been built according to precise instructions by God, constructed of beautiful wood and with the finest craftsmanship, as would be appropriate in making a carrying case for a holy object. As everyone packed up their things and prepared to continue the wilderness trek, the new tablets with the Ten Commandments on them were ceremoniously carried out and placed carefully in the ark. And alongside those perfect new tablets, so this rabbinical commentary says, the broken pieces of the first set of tablets were lovingly placed inside the ark. So the journey continued, and the people took with them the ark that held two sets of tablets, one perfect, one broken, both sacred. The commentary concludes this episode of the story by saying that it is not only our perfect actions that matter and are worth remembering forever, but our imperfect actions have a place, a holy place, right alongside our perfect actions. For the failures contribute to making us who we are in all our wholeness. I once watched an unusual acrobatic performance on a television variety show. The acrobats vigorously set up and attempted one daring stunt after another, but did not manage to complete any of them successfully. Juggled items were dropped, somersaults ended in awkward falls, balancing acts toppled over every time. Yet the acrobats never seemed to recognize, or else they pretended they didn't recognize, that they were continually failing. Instead, they bowed, inviting applause, just the same as if they had performed without a hitch. The audience laughed harder and harder with each successive flop, applauding the skill required to screw up so many stunts. and amused by the acrobat's dogged determination to bow as if everything was going splendidly. In that as yet unrealized church of infinite chances, this acrobat troupe might offer the vision of the ideal spiritual life. We set off with gusto. We are undaunted by failures. We keep going on even when nothing works. And perhaps most important of all, we offer one another support, applause, for the spirit in which all effort, even unsuccessful effort, is made. And at the end, we laugh together, not taking ourselves all that seriously, proud of the commitment that has gone into whatever we've done together. Now that could be a truly amazing church. May it be so. Amen.